Carrie Seltzer. After earning a bachelor's degree at Earlham College, Dr. Seltzer went on to earn her PhD at University of Illinois, Chicago, where her research focused on the role mammals play in seed dispersal in Tanzanian forests, with lots of implications for conservation there. Her impressive journey continued as she held positions for organizations like NSF, where she was an AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow, National Geographic, and more. She is currently the Stakeholder Engagement Strategist for iNaturalist, a team that is doing really incredible work for ecology, conservation, and science outreach, and which most of us grad students can, and everyone else really too, can probably incorporate into our outreach and research. And on top of all that, she's also an extremely kind person. So with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Carrie Seltzer.
Thanks so much, Graham, for that nice introduction. I am really pleased to be here. I flew in from Washington, D.C. on Saturday, and it's lovely to get to experience some of the Southern California sunshine and even some Southern California rain. So I'm really getting I've had a wonderful few days visiting so far. And really grateful for the invitation to speak, and have enjoyed the meetings that I've had this morning with some of the grad students and postdocs that have resulted in a few tweaks to my presentation based on their interests. So thanks, Graham, for giving a little bit of my background, but based on some of the things we talked about, I thought I would recap a few of those things, and in particular, one of the most important side projects during my PhD. So like he already mentioned, I have a BA in biology from Earlham College, which is in Indiana, and then studied plant-animal interactions for my PhD. And after that, or I'll say as part of that, I did this side project called Dance Your PhD. And I should note that the work that I was depicting here through dance, seed dispersal by giant pouched rats, is something that I collaborated with Colin Kramer on. Colin didn't do the fieldwork part, but he did help a lot with the data analysis for this project. And when I left academia, when I went into job interviews, this is what people wanted to ask me about. No questions about my dissertation outside of my dance. So to all of the grad students out there, sometimes those side projects can be really, really important. I was very briefly a postdoc at the University of Maryland, but shortly thereafter, I started working at National Geographic. And in that capacity, I started collaborating very closely with iNaturalist. And then, as Graham also mentioned, I was a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow at the National Science Foundation for about a year and a half. And if any of you are looking for careers beyond academia, I absolutely recommend you have this fellowship on your radar, because it's an incredible experience that really opened my eyes to just how transferable my skills were to fields and kinds of jobs that I couldn't have even imagined until I went through that interview process. But I have been very fortunate since 2018 to have my dream job working for iNaturalist, and I'm pleased to tell you all about that today. I like to begin presentations about iNaturalist with immense gratitude for the iNaturalist community, because we have a small core team of people that helps keep the train on the tracks, but iNaturalist would be nothing if not for the millions of people now who have made it a part of their lives, making observations, sharing observations, graciously sharing their expertise. We are immensely grateful, and I know that some of you are present online and some of you are present in the room, so thank you. I also like to learn a little bit about the audience in the process. So as a show of hands, for those of you who are in the room, who has an iNaturalist account? Awesome. I hope you picked up stickers on your way in. And I'd also love to know who's got it on your phone right now. Sometimes people have one or the other, but not both. Awesome. Well, as you are all intimately aware, we are facing some serious challenges globally. We know that people are increasingly disconnected from the natural world, and that many of the species on planet Earth are threatened with extinction. And so iNaturalist, our solution to both of those problems is technology that helps connect people to nature. And through that connection to nature comes this incredibly powerful engine for global science and conservation. At its core, iNaturalist's mission is to connect people to nature through technology and to support the protection of biodiversity. In terms of how it works, many of you have experienced this firsthand already, but it's a social network where people share their encounters with biodiversity and crowdsource species identifications. And it does work across all your platforms. So if you've only used it on your phone, I encourage you to check out the website as well. I like to say that the phone is really designed to streamline the experience of sharing your own observations, but there's a lot more functionality that's available on the website. So definitely experience both. An observation in iNaturalist contains a few key things. One, we need to know who you are. You have to have an account to post to iNaturalist, though you don't necessarily have to have your real name associated with it if you want to keep that private. We need to know where you saw what you saw in the form of coordinates, preferably some evidence of what you saw. Usually that's in the form of photos, but sometimes you can also record sound. Then we need to know when you saw it, at least a date, if not a timestamp. And then this piece of what you saw is where the power of the iNaturalist community really comes into focus, because even if you don't know exactly what you saw, the community can help you with that through the crowdsourcing process. And in iNaturalist, all of the taxa are attached to a single tree of life. And through this tree of life means that you can start with a very general identification of what you saw, and the community can help it progress to something finer. So I always like to emphasize, especially among a crowd of biologists, that it's okay to add a very general identification. You don't have to get everything to genus or to species. It's okay to post observations that just say bird or just say plant, because the community can help you with that. iNaturalist is a vibrant and active community, and this is happening across borders every hour of every day. This is a snapshot of activity from just 1 hour on iNaturalist a few months ago. So the dots in orange are showing where observations were posted, and then the lines are connecting the approximate location of the person who added an identification to those observations that were getting posted. So in this hour that I'm presenting, we'll get about 5,000 new observations, about 12,000 new identifications, about 200 new participants, and there will probably be about 8 new projects created every hour of every day. Part of this global growth of iNaturalist has been possible thanks to numerous collaborations that we have with institutions around the world. Each of these places is where we have a relationship with a museum or a often national level nonprofit, and they promote iNaturalist in their countries and provide a lot of local support and community building, and we have special data sharing relationships with them to facilitate the use of the data collected by the communities there in conservation and science. So iNaturalist has grown rapidly. It was launched in 2008 initially, and for the last several years, it has been almost doubling every year. So you can look back at 2016, which looks like a tiny, almost nothing on the chart now, but if you looked back at the previous 5 or 6 years, you would see that same doubling trend, right? So You can also see the dramatic seasonality of activity on iNaturalist. We have a lot more observations posted during the Northern Hemisphere spring. There is both more land area and more people in the Northern Hemisphere than the Southern Hemisphere. So we have we're sort of just starting to enter our busier time of the year now. To put some overall numbers on iNaturalist activity since the beginning, we just passed 90 million verifiable observations. So that's excluding the observations of pets that get posted or the garden plants. We actually have about 10 million of those observations, but we've got 90 million verifiable ones. And those observations represent almost 350,000 unique species. One of the main ways that iNaturalist data is shared beyond iNaturalist and incorporated into all kinds of research, which I'll go into, is through the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, or GBIF for short. So GBIF aggregates many, many different kinds of data sets, a lot of museum records, a lot of other citizen science data, but increasingly, iNaturalist is a very important part of the GBIF picture, especially when you're looking at recent data. So there's a few caveats to this, but if you look at data since 2020, observations made since 2020, and if you exclude birds, because eBird is a massive, massive, massive data set that totally dwarfs iNaturalist in terms of the number of records. But if you look at all the other taxa, and then if you also look outside of Europe, Europe has a lot of sort of national level kind of similar citizen science schemes that have been around for a really long time. So iNaturalist doesn't have, it's not as big a part of the pie in Europe. But if you look, aside from birds, aside from Europe, 85% of the most recent records in GBIF are coming from iNaturalist. One of the awesome benefits that comes to iNaturalist from sharing records with GBIF is the citation tracking system that they have. So who has ever downloaded data from GBIF? Cool, a lot of hands. So when you download from GBIF, you get a digital object identifier, or a DOI. And then when you cite that DOI in a publication, it is tracked back to all of the data sets, including iNaturalist. And so there are more than 2,000 publications that have cited a data set that contains at least one record from iNaturalist. That number is growing very rapidly. So if you look at the iNaturalist data set on GBIF and click into that citation count, you'll be taken to a page where you can filter and extensively explore the research that's just some of the research that has made use of data from iNaturalist. I want to emphasize that the citation tracking that happens through GBIF is the best way that we have to know what data is coming out that's using iNaturalist. It's a fire hose. And so this is, my plea is for you to cite the DOI whenever possible. And I want to give an example of a time when I was really excited that this worked. I was on my phone browsing recent publications citing iNaturalist data, like you do, and I recognized that this one looked familiar. This was a recently published dissertation about fishes in Gabon, and this is someone who I've met, Joe Cutler. Well, it just so happened that I saw Joe that night. So in person, I got to thank Joe for citing the DOI for the iNaturalist data set associated with his dissertation, and I tweeted about it. This is Joe. When Joe uses iNaturalist data from GBIF, he cites the DOI. Be like Joe, cite the DOI. Possibly one of the nerdiest hashtags ever, but you'll probably remember to cite the DOI now. There is also a lot of activity happening outside of GBIF downloads, and we are also trying to keep track of what's happening in that realm. So If you perhaps have a paper that used iNaturalist data in the past and didn't cite the DOI, or you have one in the works and that ship has sailed, there's still a place for you to capture that. On the iNaturalist forum, which is a very active place, we have not one, but 2 different wikis for tracking other publications that are using iNaturalist data. So you're welcome to jump in there and contribute to that. We could not keep track of it, I should say, without help of many members of the community who chip in on that, because like I said, it's a fire hose of science coming from iNaturalist data these days. So when iNaturalist was first, since it's pretty early days, the key components are the members of the community, the data that the community generates, and then the largely external applications of those data, since the data is being broadly shared for science. And I'm going to focus first on some of those external data applications, just to give a few examples of the kinds of things that are possible. So now is when I ask you, who has published a paper with data from iNaturalist? Awesome, there's a few hands. Who has extracted and or used data from iNaturalist in any capacity? Exported it for, cool, more hands, awesome. Well, to sort of broadly categorize some of these applications, I'll say that one exciting thing that happens from iNaturalist is things like species rediscovery. And this can happen from a single record. Here's an example from California of a cicada that it turns out hadn't been seen in 100 years. We have a little write-up on our iNaturalist blog about this. This person found this cicada on this mesh that was covering her blueberry bushes. No idea what it was, posted it to iNaturalist, recognized by a member of the community. Very cool story. Another thing that can happen from just one record is invasive species detection. Here's an example just from this area. Member of the community posted a picture of this butterfly, which was pretty quickly identified as a lime swallowtail. But what I'm showing here is some of the conversation that happened on this observation. Because the first comment here is, was this in a butterfly house? If so, mark it as captive cultivated so the range maps remain accurate. And the person says it was free flying in our garden. So suddenly this is not like a butterfly in a butterfly house, or this is a different kind of circumstance. And so the conversation goes on. This is an observation of interest to the California Department of Food and Agriculture due to its pest status for citrus. So it now is on the state level radar as a species of concern in Southern California because of that observation. Other sorts of things in that category, of course, include range extensions. But then once you get to a few more records, iNaturalist data has been used to do things like documenting species interactions, sometimes as kind of almost like bycatch of the observation process. So this is an example where the focus of the observations was the flowers. But what you can clearly see in the photos, if you know what to look for, is this anther smut. So this maybe doesn't work. All right, so the middle photo there is an example of a flower that has anther smut, and the flower on the bottom does not have anther smut. And this is also true for herbarium specimens. So this is an interesting example of the integration of herbarium data along with iNaturalist data, and in both cases, using the observations that were focused on plants to assess the prevalence of this plant pathogen that is a little bit inconspicuous and probably wouldn't sway the observer one way or another. There probably weren't people out there like specifically looking to take photos of this anther smut. Another example of the kinds of things that you can do with sort of several hundred to a few thousand records, include a lot of applied spatial ecology. We've got a lot of projects on iNaturalist that are documenting road mortality, especially for reptiles and amphibians, using that to understand where those species are at greatest risk and put in place mitigation efforts to reduce road mortality. And there's another example of a sort of related study that used iNaturalist data that was looking at the impact of roads broadly. When you get to even, well, I would say many records now, you can use iNaturalist data to answer broad scale questions about plant phenology. And this is an example of a publication that looked at the phenology of yucca across broad spatial scales and did some additional external scoring of iNaturalist observations to measure flowering time. So I like this quote here. A key finding when comparing iNaturalist records to National Phenology Network and National Ecological, I forgot what NEON stands for, NEON monitoring annotations from iNaturalist were uniquely able to delineate extents of unusual flowering events in yucca. So this is instead basically leveraging the unique aspects of the broad spatial distribution of iNaturalist records in contrast to some of the more spatially restricted, but perhaps more in-depth studies, which also have their own strengths. Also, big scale examples of how iNaturalist data has been used. This was a study that detected change over time in butterfly distributions. So this looked at 3 different data sets. The first one was these transects of sort of intensively collected, extensively, what's the word I'm looking for? Very, very careful checklists, but very small scale, right? And then the middle one is a broader data set, but still quite a bit of intensive effort. And then the third one, with stuff all over the map, is iNaturalist records. But what's cool about this is that they were able to find the same signal in all 3 of these data sets. I want to mention too, what's important to note about all of these examples is that the iNaturalist team had, these are things we don't even know about them until publication. We were not directly involved. Our job is to keep the community happy, to make the data available, and lots of people do amazing things with it. And this is just scratching the surface of those possibilities. But increasingly, we are moving towards more internal data syntheses as well. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. And I want to acknowledge that I am not the person who is doing most of that internal work. I am only peripherally involved in the science and the software engineering that makes these internal applications possible. So I want to give a big thanks and acknowledgement to my colleagues who are pictured here, as well as some of our external collaborators that I'll mention, who made these advances possible, especially Alex Shepard, who innovates on machine learning and computer vision, Scott Laurie, who's really leading on the geospatial modeling, Patrick Leary, who gets the models from this sort of research and development phase to actually being usable in our software, and Kenichi Ueda and Amanda Bullington, who make it work for the users, and Abhas Misraraj, who designs our beautiful interfaces so that things actually make sense for our community. So when I was leading into the external data uses, I highlighted just the sort of original vertical of iNaturalist. But starting around 2017, we added this one kind of synthesis, which is our computer vision model. So this is what I think many of you who've used iNaturalist have experienced, getting suggestions of visual similarity. So this work started in around 2016, led by Alex Shepard, and then was furthered through a collaboration with a group called Visipedia, which is a Caltech, Cornell Tech collaboration, beginning in around 2017. And Grant Van Horn was especially instrumental in this work. And what we did initially was we looked at the species in our data set that had at least 20 research grade observations. Around this time, iNaturalist had a few million observations, maybe in the realm of like 4 or 5 million observations. So we were working with a much smaller data set initially. But we used this 20 research grade observations threshold as our cutoff for inclusion in this first model that we trained. So our initial model had about 13,000 species that we trained a machine learning model to recognize based on visual similarity. You can see here that we have a lot of observations that have a very few number of observations and a fewer number of species that have that sort of made the cut with that threshold. And over time, as our model development has evolved, we have been, and the data set has grown, we've been able to include more and more species in the model. We've gone about this a few different ways, but broadly, what you can take away from this is that we've been able to increase the number of taxa that we include in the model, and the number of training images available for each of those taxa has been increasing. We have experimented with limiting the number of observations or photos that we include in the model to 1,000, which is why you see some of those cut off sharply at 1,000. But we've also experimented with including a lot more photos. One of the trade-offs there is that it may sort of overtrain on some of the more abundant species in the data set. So it's sort of a constant, it's always an iterative process of figuring out how to adjust our training process to get the best results for use by the iNaturalist community. This is another perspective on the growth of data incorporated into the model. From 2017, our model, like I said, we were working with the overall data set of about 3 million observations, whereas the most recent model training that we kicked off a few months ago, that includes about 25 million images. So as the amount of data that we're working with has grown, we've had to adjust some of our processes as well as some of our expectations around how long this process will take. So it does take on the order of a few to several months to train one of these new models. And we do hope to have a new model ready for release later this year. I'll save my colleagues by not putting any firm timeline on that yet. And this is sort of a species-centric way of looking at how we've trained the model over time. Number of classes generally corresponds to species, but we have done this a few different ways. So the first models depicted in brown there were working strictly with species level classes. So that means that if we had a group that's maybe really difficult to identify to species, you can get it to genus, you can't quite get it to species. It means that we just didn't have it in the model because we didn't have any observations of it identified at the species level. So we did our first few models that way, but then a few years ago, we changed our approach and started not considering things strictly as species, but approaching it as taxonomic leaves on the tree. So this means, for example, that if we've got one of these difficult to discriminate groups, but we have a lot of observations that are identified at the genus level, it means that we will train the model to identify the genus, not the species, but just the genus. And for even some more lesser known or obscure organisms, we'll take that even up to the family level for some things that are just really uncommonly observed or really difficult to identify. But for things that you encounter on a regular basis, especially here in California, it's probably going to be species level stuff. In case you're not familiar with what it looks like sort of in context, what we come out with is something that you give it a photo and it makes suggestions of species that are visually similar. For the first few years, we didn't really have a good way of incorporating geospatial information into those suggestions, but thankfully last year we did start adding this, whether or not it's been seen nearby, which helps eliminate some geographically inappropriate suggestions, even if they look visually similar. So that did clean up some of the results. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we're going to push that even further and make those results even better. So this is just a photo I took in my neighborhood. And you can see that it has suggested a few different violet species, all in the same genus. And it has also made what we call a common ancestor suggestion of the genus Viola, because all of the top suggestions are in that genus. So this is a way to give a sort of more conservative identification suggestion, incorporating some of those, that information. Another thing that this computer vision work has enabled is our companion app called Seek by iNaturalist. So I want to ask at this point, who's got Seek on their phone? A few people, definitely not all this. Okay, you've got to try Seek. You've got to try Seek because when it works, it really feels like magic. So what's showing in the video here is how you don't even have to take a picture with Seek. It will start making suggestions immediately based on whatever is in frame of the camera. And sometimes it can jump straight to species, but we designed Seek to try and be conservatively correct without necessarily being precise. And so sometimes observations do, sometimes you get stuck at dicots. We get a lot of emails about dicots. We get a lot of tweets about dicots. We also get a lot of tweets about misidentified dogs. People get really upset when Seek can't identify their dog as a dog, but we didn't train it to identify dogs. So anyways, this is the kind of thing that would not have been possible without these exciting innovations in computer vision, which also allowed for compression of the model so that it fits on your device. The way it works in iNaturalist, we're sort of asking the iNaturalist API for a response, and so you need internet for that. But Seek, you can take this off the trail. You do not have to have cell reception, and Seek can give you quick answers, and hopefully it'll send you in the right direction. Seek is also designed to be kid-friendly and privacy conscious. So if you're not interested in sharing where you've been, posting observations publicly, Seek is a great way to keep a personal record of that. And you can optionally post things to iNaturalist, but you don't have to. So definitely, if there's kids in your life, introduce them to Seek. There's also badges and a little bit of gamification there. So check it out if you haven't yet. So analogous to the computer vision model, we're now working on something that we're sort of internally calling our global eco insights model. And what this is doing is really trying to tackle that issue of geospatial synthesis in a way that is really going to open a lot of new and exciting possibilities for iNaturalist. This is work that is really, we really credit Oshin Mahoda for his innovative work here, because essentially what it's doing is it's very analogous to how we're training our computer vision model, in that it's using machine learning, but it's only on the observation locations. And it's using a neural network of this presence-only data for the same, using the same threshold, these about almost 50,000 species or taxa now that we're training the computer vision model on. We're using that same set of organisms and observations to train this geospatial model. And crucially, we are including no environmental covariates right now. It's based purely on the iNaturalist observations. So what happens is that from this model, which I should say is really in the research and development stage right now, so there's not like a tool you can use yet on iNaturalist that shows this, but given a location, the model returns a vector of the probability of any given species occurring in there across the 50,000 species included. So the first way that we're going to use this is in further refining those computer vision suggestions based on visual similarity to give even better suggestions. So as an example of what this can look like, if you've got two salamanders that look visually very similar, species A is found in sort of the Midwest, species B is found sort of in the Southeast. They've got some range overlap, but it's hard to see, but that like white dot there, that's where this particular example is. So the computer vision model comes up with a probability based on visual similarity, but then the geospatial model comes up with a probability based on the location and the likelihood of each of those species occurring in that place. So then you get the joint probability of it being species A or species B. And you can see that although the computer vision model was leaning towards species A, once you've got the combined probability, it's much more likely to be species B. So this is a way that we're excited about really being able to give our community even better suggestions to eliminate more of the geographically inappropriate ones and hopefully make everybody happier. Another application for this is range maps. So we are just in the early stages of a collaboration with IUCN to produce new range maps, which of course can inform conservation assessments based on range size. This will also give us an opportunity to compare the modeled ranges that come out of this to the existing range maps that IUCN has for many species, but we hope that this will make species range maps available for many more species than currently have them through IUCN. And a third application that we're really excited about is surfacing aberrant observations. And probably one of the sort of highest profile examples of this sort of application is invasive species detection. So like I said, this model is really still in like the R&D phase, but when we first started kind of like taking real-time iNaturalist observations and running it through this to see what would pop out, like what pops out as maybe in the wrong place. There's a big category of things that are misidentified, right? They're far out of range. Probably the computer vision suggestion, maybe from Seek, led them in the wrong direction, and those can be corrected. So that'll be another really useful application of this. But this interesting example popped out. Right now, invasive species detection happens a lot on iNaturalist, but it really gets surfaced in a very manual way by the community. So this jumping spider is found, its native distribution is in Southeast Asia. But recently, an observation popped up in Rio de Janeiro. It was noticed by the community and they wrote it up. But when we ran recent observations through this new model, this other observation in Manaus popped up. So not only is this spider in Rio de Janeiro, it's also in Manaus. And that's the kind of thing that we hope to be able to highlight and notify people about when these new introductions pop up. So we're really excited about these possibilities. The nearest term that you'll hopefully see later this year is the application of the sort of refinement of the computer vision suggestions within the iNaturalist ecosystem, starting work on the collaboration with IUCN2. And we're excited to further this piece as well, but this is a little bit further from something you'll be able to see in the nearest term. But I know, given this audience, that a lot of you are interested in working with iNaturalist data. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the data access options that exist outside of GBIF. You all know to cite the DOI whenever you can, but I'll tell you how else you can get data. You can export data directly from iNaturalist. iNaturalist has a lot more data, and if you really want a lot of data, we point you to these other things like GBIF. So this is especially a useful tool if you're working with something in the order of maybe tens of thousands of records. So you can filter for the set of observations you want and get a CSV export. You may have to wait a little bit. We may have to limit that functionality to some extent during our busiest times of the year, which happens like late April, early May. Another way that you can get data is through the iNaturalist API, and there have been some additional tools that have been built on the API, but I definitely encourage you, if you're so inclined, to check out our API documentation and give it a go. There are all kinds of things that you can get from the API that you can't get strictly from an observation export, like annotations of sex or annotations of life stage, things like that. If you're interested in that kind of data, check out the API. It's probably what you'll want to use. Then if what you're interested in is a lot of images, this is when we send you to the Amazon Open Data Registry, where we've got a big way for you to access a lot of images at once. So if you're working on something, you're working on training a computer vision model for some reason, check this out. And we've got some additional extensive documentation that a member of our community posted on the iNaturalist forum that helps walk you through how to work with this, because it is a massive data set. So we're grateful for our member of the community who took the time to do that. Another thing I want to mention that I originally wasn't planning to, but conversations this morning made me realize this probably is of interest. Another place where you can explore data about interspecific interactions in a way that you can't on iNaturalist is this program called GLOBI, which is short for Global Biotic Interactions. And on that website, they have data from a lot of sources, kind of analogous to GBIF in that way. But what you can do is say, I am interested in spotted lanternfly, for example, which hasn't made it to California yet, thankfully, but is a big problem back east. And you can look at all of the species that it has been recorded feeding on based on observations in iNaturalist. There's a part of iNaturalist that's sort of not core to observations, but it's called observation fields. And there's a lot of observation fields that can capture things like this species visited a flower of this species, or this species was eaten by this species, things like that. So those are all pulled into GLOBI, and you can, there's a lot of different ways to explore this. So if you're interested in species interactions, you're interested in what might be possible from iNaturalist data, I definitely recommend checking out GLOBI. And with that, I would like to thank you all for your time and attention, and I'd be happy to answer your questions.
I've got a couple actually, but so one is I'm sure everybody uses iNaturalist. You know, there are research-based observations of species in a habitat, especially in a room like this. There's experts who don't know, and you know, you see a lot of misidentifications. the obvious ones, the ones that you expect to see when you see.
Uh-huh.
Is there, and you know, everything we talked about today, all this directions, it all depends on the view, right? And so is there, other than people simply widening corrections, which is a long way of doing it, is there any internal way of sort of upgrading these? Is that going on?
Okay, so I'll try to rephrase that to make sure that the folks online can hear. You're asking, basically you're saying that all of these things that are built on iNaturalist are based on the assumption that identifications are correct. And so are there ways other than the sort of community, the community identification process of verifying things? The short answer is no, not yet. We have thought about moving in that direction, but right now, the thing to do if you see misidentifications is to add a disagreeing identification. And in some ways, there's maybe eventually we'll find good shortcuts, but for now there's no good shortcuts. And we really do appreciate all of the experts who graciously spend time on iNaturalist, adding identifications, confirming identifications, and especially correcting identifications, especially when they take the time to explain the nuance of some more difficult to distinguish and identify species. I think one of the cool opportunities for iNaturalist, or because of iNaturalist, is the ability to share expertise that maybe very not widely known, but to sort of build a community of enthusiasts around these even difficult problems. And I think there's some really cool examples of that in the community around galls, which can be really difficult to identify, and leaf miners, and parasitic wasps, and things like that. In terms of perhaps automated systems for being able to assess confidence in a community identification, we've done some explorations, but we don't have anything that we feel is ready for sort of near-term implementation. But we know that we need to be mindful of especially incentives for falsification, and that especially as iNaturalist continues to grow, that's something that we need to be attentive to, and we can't take it for granted. See another hand over here.
Yeah, so I'm curious. So I imagine that there's some ascertained bias in what gets reported by iNaturalist, particularly extremely common things are probably proportionally less likely to be identified than extremely rare things. And is this kind of a, firstly, do you sort of understand how maybe the relationship between true abundance and reported abundance, and also is that sort of is that something that you feel like you're able to build around and try and understand these?
Yeah, okay, so I'll try to paraphrase that. The question is sort of acknowledging that there's bias in both what people choose to observe and share with iNaturalist and what they choose to identify in iNaturalist. Sorry, what was the second part of that?
Okay. So firstly, if you know how that, if you know what that relationship is,
yeah.
The underlying links, and also
right.
Is that ascertained bias mean that you factor into ecological?
Right, okay, so then how well do we understand that, and how do we account for that? So there's been some external work on this. I can't remember the exact paper off the top of my head, but I know that someone did a study just with birds and looking that I think they compared iNaturalist data and eBird data and found that bird observations in iNaturalist were weighted towards larger bodied birds. And I think that probably comes from larger birds being easier to both notice and easier to take a photograph of, especially if you're taking a photo with your cell phone camera. So yes, there are absolutely biases in the data. And I think that, whenever it comes to using iNaturalist data for research, you need to carefully think about what kinds of biases are manageable in the iNaturalist data, and how they might impact your particular use case. We know too that iNaturalist data is very heavily biased to where people are. If you look at density of iNaturalist observations, it corresponds very strongly with density of people. So, so there's certainly a lot of geographic bias as well as taxonomic bias in iNaturalist. We haven't explicitly figured out how to account for those things in the things like the range map modeling or the but I think it's probably most relevant in that one when it comes to visually similar suggestions, because that is sort of working on the things that most people observe in the community. It's kind of like optimized for the kinds of things that people are already putting in iNaturalist. But it's a great question and something everyone should be thinking about in data use, and something that we'll have to continue to keep an eye on as we develop more internal syntheses.
Yeah, I hadn't heard of iNaturalist API before. I was wondering if you could tell us more about what that is and what additional data can be obtained from that.
Sure. So go back a couple slides. First and foremost, the iNaturalist API is what we use to send data internally within our own systems. So our mobile app is built on our API, our website is built on our API, but there are ways for other people to build things on our API. An example that comes to mind is, I think that a few years ago, someone made a superb owl instead of Super Bowl. They made a superb owl site that queried the iNaturalist API to show you what species of owl have been seen near you based on iNaturalist observations, and showed the photos that have been recorded. So sometimes people use it to build like fun sort of quiz things like that. But people do also query it with a sort of data-centric view to get things like annotations that you can't get in the observation exports. So I'd say there's just a lot more flexibility, and if you're savvy and so inclined, check it out. But we do rate limit it, so you can't just like go use our API to get 90 million observations. We'll probably block your IP address if that happens. So, so heed the best practices, and hopefully the documentation will get you what you need to know.
Yeah, just having used iNaturalist and GDIF to make polls of these community science data sets, I know that there's often issues with kind of what we call species. There's issues where the taxonomy doesn't align. I was wondering in what ways is iNaturalist working to kind of make that sort of discordant taxonomy more unified between different platforms? Yeah,
so the question is essentially, taxonomy is complicated and hard. How do you deal with it? Taxonomy is, of course, an ever-changing effort at consensus, and we internally have this one taxonomy that we build through reference to external authorities for different groups. So for plants, for example, we follow Kew Botanic Gardens Plants of the World Online, and we have a system too for explicitly deviating from the external authority that we follow if for some reason the sense of the community is that deviation makes sense. However, our preference is to encourage members of the community to sort out any taxonomic disagreements with the external source, so that we can to the extent possible, we want the taxonomic arguments to happen in other places and for iNaturalist to just reference those external authorities, but it doesn't always work that way. So we have built a sophisticated tools for mapping and tracking the changes, the taxonomic changes that happen. I should look to chat for questions, I am being told. Do you want to just read some of them? I feel. Oh, they sent them directly to me. Okay. Let's see if I can do this. Oh, I see them here. Okay, great. Okay. I need my cursor back. Okay, I see it. All right. There is a question. Why do you filter out observations of cultivated and domestic organisms? They are part of the ecosystem too. So this is I would say it goes back to an early decision made about iNaturalist to focus on wild organisms. I absolutely agree that cultivated and domestic organisms are part of our ecosystem. Humans are not separate from nature. We are intimately connected to it. And so I do admit that those sorts of observations currently have kind of second-class status on iNaturalist because we don't make it as easy to surface them or find them or identify them. And we know that long-term, this is an area where we have to improve. But like changing just about anything in iNaturalist these days, it's complicated, and any big change, like a different treatment of observations of captive and cultivated organisms, requires a lot of careful thought and rollout. So I agree that this is something that we need to do. We're just not ready to tackle that question just yet.
Right. With that, we've come up on the end of the hour. Let's thank Dr. Seltzer again for a wonderful talk. There's some things we have more questions to ask after.
Thanks, everyone, and thanks to everyone who tuned in online.